Agenda-setting theory is a theory that has been discussed for decades that affects the majority of the population around the world. I'm Alexandra Algarra, and I'll be discussing agenda-setting theory, its history, what it encompasses, and how it affects everyone on a daily basis. Agenda-setting theory is the ability of the news media to influence the salience of topics on the public agenda, essentially meaning that if the topic is discussed frequently and prominently in the news, then the audience will regard the issue as more important. The news media picks and chooses what news it wants people to pay attention to. It doesn't necessarily affect people's opinions, but it does affect what they will have an opinion on due to its constant prominence in the news. Now let's discuss in more detail the history of agenda-setting theory, a model of the theory and its components, as well as pros, cons, advantages, and disadvantages to the theory. The basic agenda-setting theory model is depicted here. It's a constantly revolving cycle affecting how people perceive reality. It begins with reality, the actual events and topics that can be discussed occurring in the world, such as politics, economy, science, society, etc. News media then selects, omits, and frames these stories and puts them in the news, which then sets an agenda for people. This agenda that is set by the news media then affects people's perception of reality, allowing them to create opinions based on the news that they have been selectively exposed to. The agenda-setting theory was formally developed in 1968 by Dr. Mass McCombs and Dr. Donald Shaw. They are faculty members at UCLA who conducted the Chapel Hill study based on the 1968 presidential election. The two doctors observed a strong correlation between people's opinions on issues and what was broadcast in local and national news. It established a degree to which media determines public opinion. The prominence and saliency to which the topics covered in news media greatly affected this observation by the two men. The theory was formally published in the 1972 issue of Public Opinion Quarterly. While Dr. McCombs and Dr. Shaw formally developed the theory in 1972, another man, Walter Lippmann, was the first to bring this idea to light several decades prior. In 1922, in Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, he argued that mass media has a principal connection between events occurring in the world and the images that are in the minds of the public. Though he didn't state the term agenda setting, he is often credited as the first to have brought the theory to light. Then, in 1963, Bernard Cohen brought attention to this idea again in a more concrete fashion, without actually formally naming it. He stated that while the media is relatively unsuccessful in telling the public what to think, it is, however, extremely successful in telling the public what to think about. He clarifies, though, that it greatly depends on the map created for people by the news media. This map affects how they view the world. There are two basic assumptions which are prevalent in most agenda-setting theory studies. The first is that the press and media do not reflect reality, but rather they filter and shape it for the public. The second is that the media concentrates on a few issues and subjects, which leads the public to perceive those issues as more important than others. Then there are two levels of agenda-setting theory. The first level is considered the issue salience level, describing what to think about. The second is the attribute salience level, which describes how to think about. There are many pros, cons, advantages, and disadvantages to agenda-setting theory. For the corporations, big-name companies, news channels, magazines, etc., they can influence what people think about the information being shown to them, which is a pro for these companies and media. People's views being corrupted and altered based on what these news networks share and how frequently they are shared can be considered a con for people. It can be considered a con because people are being limited to what they are exposed to in the world and can have their views twisted without them even realizing it. Some disadvantages are that media users aren't ideal because they may not pay attention to details, the effect is weakened for people who have already made up their mind, and media cannot create problems, rather only alter awareness and priority. Here you can see an example that where people get their news from can also affect their opinions. Next, let's discuss the types of platforms that the agenda-setting theory uses in order to affect people across the world. These are just some examples of networks that the public views in order to receive their news, whether it's global or local news, sports news, politics, entertainment news, or any other form. These are just some of the hundreds of networks that provide people with their news. Over time, platforms have evolved, and the news media has had to adapt to keep up with the constantly changing technology to keep people coming to their channels. In the past, people solely received their news from newspapers, radio, and television. However, it has become increasingly easier for people to receive their news when and where they want, thanks to cell phones and the internet. It is even easier for news media to reach and influence people now that they have the internet and apps specifically for the company. Social media has had a large effect on people as well. News media can tweet, post stories, share images on these apps that people often cannot avoid because of their constant presence on people's phones and computers. Their effect is stronger now more than ever. Here are some examples of news media portraying stories in ways that can easily influence people. Differences that time, news media platform, and structure specifically alter how people view a story and form their opinions about them. For further references, in conclusion, agenda-setting theory has been prevalent since before its inception in 1972 and has grown in prominence over the past few decades. It affects most people around the world and is near impossible to not have this theory affect people on a daily basis.